I think we will get started. My name is Deborah Jenson. I'm a co-director of the FHI Health Humanities Lab, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our series, The Doctors Are In. It's a series in which we get a PhD and an MD together to discuss a specific topic from their complementary but differing points of view and experience. And so tonight we have Dr. Sneha Mantri, who is also one of Duke's really notable narrative medicine experts. And our topic for this evening is narrative medicine. And I thought that I would begin by asking you just to tell us a little bit about what first drew you to narrative medicine and what you experienced at Columbia University's Narrative Medicine Masters of Science program.
Yeah, absolutely. So I had been interested in literature and stories even long before I thought about medicine as a career. As an undergraduate, I majored in comparative literature. And while I was in my third year, I believe it was the fall of my third year, I took a course in illness narratives with David Morris, which was just really, like at that point I had sort of decided that medicine was the path that I was on. I was taking pre-med prerequisites, but I was still trying to figure out a way to bring literature into my work, my eventual work as a physician. And Professor Morris's class really, I think, showed me, was the first inkling that was sort of a viable path. We read a number of narratives, both from the physician's point of view, like William Carlos Williams's short stories, for instance, as well as patient narratives. So Autobiography of a Face really kind of stood out to me. And some other works that we read, some stuff by Barbara Ehrenreich, like excerpts from Welcome to Cancerland and some of her other work. And then I remember being really kind of on the fence about what I was going to do with my life for a little while. I ended up writing my thesis, my comparative literature thesis, about the way that illness is portrayed in Enlightenment literature. So looking at Moliere's The Imaginary Invalid and the differing sort of structures of illness in that work, using sort of illness as power and malingering or hypochondria as a way to exert power over the others around him. And then I went off to med school. Columbia
Can
Medical
I just ask, where were you as an undergrad?
The University of Virginia.
Okay.
And so Columbia's medical curriculum when I was there was a sort of what we now call a traditional medical curriculum. You do a year of kind of the normal human body, a year of the body in various states of disease. Your third year is your clinical year, and your fourth year is your sort of elective time. And so while I was there, narrative medicine sort of, I guess, was formalized in a lot of ways at Columbia. Rita Sharon kind of wrote some of the original work, making this kind of a more formal field or subfield within medical humanities, if you will. And so there was a lot of narrative medicine sort of sprinkled into those first 2 years of med school. And I found myself really enjoying those modules and those courses. As second-year med students, we got to take selectives in narrative medicine, which were really, really fun. I did one actually, I was thinking about doing one that was kind of a more traditional illness narratives course, and I ended up going totally in a different direction and doing one on film and medicine. Marcia Hurst was the professor. We watched a lot of really interesting movies like Dirty Pretty Things. I don't know if any of you have read it. I guess it's kind of sci-fi-ish. It's about, well, not really. It's about organ harvesting from unwilling people who are sort of in vulnerable states. Fiction, but obviously touching on some really serious ethical issues. We watched Ikiru, and so that I think really broadened my perspective of what narrative medicine could be. It wasn't just reading a text, but sort of thinking about embodied movement in a film, for instance, and the angle of the camera and the different perspectives that one could take. And then I sort of, I went back to sort of med school, and I was like, I'm going to, do med school. And in the back of my head, I was like, how am I going to keep this thing that really interests me, how am I going to keep that sort of alive? And at the time, Columbia had just started their dual degree program, or their master's program in narrative medicine. And so they were offering it as an optional dual degree for medical students, as well as for folks in the community and attendings and all over, really, to take as a standalone master's. And I was unsure for a long time about whether or not I really wanted to make that commitment, because despite all of the interest that I had in this field and the fact that it really excited me, I was worried about things like student loans, and it was going to mean an extra year of med school and an extra year of living in New York, which I was really not happy with at the time, for a lot of reasons. And so I was going back and forth I remember I wrote up the whole application, and it was just saved on my computer, and I couldn't bring myself to actually send it in. I didn't know what I was going to do. And then by this time I was a third year medical student. I was on my medicine rotation. So this was in late December, right around sort of the holidays, in December. In New York City, and I was on the HIV/AIDS service, or the infectious disease service, which was predominantly folks with HIV/AIDS. And there was this one patient that we had who was dying, and we all knew he was dying. And nobody on the inpatient team was able to tell him that he was dying. Nobody was able to have that conversation with him. And he genuinely thought that he was getting better and he was going to be going home. And we sort of knew that was not where this was leading for him. And that was a real struggle for me as a third year med student, because I felt very strongly that this guy needed to know what was happening, and what we thought was going to happen within really weeks. And I didn't feel that I had any kind of authority to say that to him, because I was the third year medical student. So I was really getting, quite frankly, burnt out by this sort of dilemma that I was holding in my head. I remember one day I walked into the med school library to study for an exam. And I literally ran into a friend of mine who was an MD PhD, and he was doing his PhD off in the lab. And he, and I was like, I'm so sorry. And he was like, you seem really off and distracted. What's going on? So I told him this story about this patient who was dying, and I didn't know what to do, and I didn't know who to talk to and how to resolve this issue. And what he said to me, I still remember it verbatim, and we're still friends, but he said to me, you're going to have to get over that if you want to be a good doctor. And that was just such a shock to me, because my immediate reaction was no, I have to be able to engage with this, and I have to be able to resolve this tension and this issue if I'm going to be a good doctor. And so that's the moment at which I was like, I need to apply for the narrative medicine program and figure out how to hear this patient's story. Not just this patient, but any patient's story, and how to convey some of these really challenging, difficult conversations to them in a way that fits with their story. So that was it, and that was really kind of one of these decisions that, in retrospect, has really sort of shaped my career in a number of different ways that I did not anticipate happening when I was, a third-year med student in the library, but it was really a fantastic decision for me on multiple levels.
Well, that makes me think of two questions. One is how you would describe that feeling of getting close to a burnout sort of experience. And the other is whether narrative medicine really has made those conversations more productive, if not, perhaps easier, but somehow more where you're trying to go with them.
Yeah. I mean, I think so. Burnout's an interesting topic and an interesting thing to talk about, because I think it gets talked about a lot recently within sort of medicine and medical education, and everybody's worried about, sky-high burnout levels and what that's leading to in the profession. And the way it often gets talked about is these sort of three phases or three axes of emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, and reduced professional efficacy. And that's how, a lot of these burnout inventories are structured. And so a lot of the sort of burnout prevention programs or treatment programs are geared towards helping people with work-life balance and so on, and sort of personal hobbies and things that people find helpful in their non-professional lives, which I think is valuable. But I think it misses this dimension that I think my dilemma as a student really captured, which is moral distress and moral injury, and trying to hold the tension of what you know to be right, meaning telling this person about his prognosis, within the sort of hierarchy and all of the structures of medicine, and feeling sort of powerless as the most junior person on the team, who like, what do I know? Like, I'm a medical student, I just read textbooks, but yet sort of knowing that I knew something that the rest of the team was missing, and not being able to convey that. So I think when I say burnout, that's particularly in that sense, but even just more broadly, that's what I mean, is this sense of kind of uncertainty or ambiguity or moral distress. And I do think that narrative medicine makes that feeling go away for me. And it certainly has made those conversations easier in a lot of ways, because I think one of the things that narrative medicine does is that it one of the real focuses of the program, or foci of the program, is to think about perspective and the ways that our perspectives may differ and change. And I think particularly by reading fiction, you learn to swap or see things from a different perspective or a different point of view in a way that makes it much easier to then have those conversations on a purely practical level in the clinic with a patient. I just came from one of those conversations with one of my patients who has a really serious illness for which there is unfortunately no treatment yet. And knowing how to sort of see things. It's not just my perspective as a physician, kind of knowing all of this stuff about her like epidemiology of her prognosis and what proteins are involved. Like, that's not really what matters. And what matters is sort of helping people figure out what a roadmap is going to look like for the next, year, 5 years, in her case. And I think being able to see things from a different perspective, not just sort of doctor self, but also personal self, is one of the real benefits of the narrative medicine program for me.
That makes me think of a poem by Raymond Carver, What the Doctor Told Me, and it's about his actual experience as someone being given a diagnosis of lung cancer, terminal lung cancer. And it really is all about those narrative positions and the way that his responses would change in relation to the doctor's questions, even as sort of a different part of him was stepping outside that kind of conditioned response to those questions. And in the very end, he says, and I almost thanked him for a gift that no one else had ever given me or would ever give me or something. And it's, the whole poem is is both offhand and profoundly bitter and shell-shocked. I mean, depersonalized. And so it really is a wonderful example of both the ways that a sort of, anodyne verbal stances in conversation can affect people profoundly in such a vulnerable moment, and of just the way that something that, has to be done, like the giving of a diagnosis, is nevertheless something that the patient, may never have thought that they would experience, will never experience in any other context in the same way, and around which they may have to shift their entire worldview.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think it becomes really challenging sometimes because some of our, at least in neurology, some of our diagnoses are not always clear up front. So there's always this sort of tension and ambiguity of like, is this really the right diagnosis? Especially early on, what else could this be? And having those conversations, I think, over and over with folks can, sometimes it is a process, and sort of revisiting the plan. But you're right. I mean, it does sort of change people's what they envision their retirement is going to be like is maybe totally different from what they had anticipated.
Yeah. And around those sort of, moving target diagnoses where, disease states are not fully understood and it's still being worked out both therapeutically and in terms of the actual, nosology of the issue. To what extent is that a sort of scientific narrative? And to what extent is it just based in, very empirical, physiological realities and knowledge about them?
Yeah, I mean that's a big question.
Sorry.
No, I mean it's a good question. It's a good question, right? Because like there is this sort of there's this narrative that we tell ourselves, this grand narrative of medicine, of sort of medical progress. And like we understand things now so much better than we did 50 years ago, so much better than medieval physicians did, so much better than the ancients did, and this sort of sense of kind of always moving forward, which I think really obscures a lot of that uncertainty that we live with in medicine. Like I tell my medical students, patients don't read the textbook, but also the textbook doesn't read the patient, right? So like what I mean by that is that like the ways that we define disease have changed dramatically over time in the same patient. We heard, stuff like this recently from Danielle Spencer in her talk on metagnosis. The ways that we sort of define disease and put these little boxes around things are constantly shifting. And some of that is based in biology and biological understanding, but a lot of it is sort of based on expert opinion. And who are the people making these decisions and these sort of these new criteria that come out for multiple sclerosis or progressive supranuclear palsy or what have you. It's a lot of it is really sort of expert opinion, which is inherently subjective because the experts are going to be subjective about what they think is disease 1 versus disease 2.
And yet it's expert opinion sort of, surrounding a field of figures and statistics and, graphs. And Bruno Latour talks about how all of the sort of laboratory experimentation of medicine and science reaches its point of power as opposed to its sort of performative unfolding specifically around those little inscriptions that then, can be sort of used in studies and cited and become part of the apparatus of grant seeking and then of insurance approvals. And, so expert opinions are there and relying on this sort of transformation into a very sort of depersonalized set of data that
Right.
we rely on. And so Bruno Latour views that as sort of a defensiveness of science and medicine, and an attempt to show, a sort of radical objectivity by erasing the markers of subjectivity. And certainly medical research operates under very different narratological rules than do literary narratives. You specifically need to keep the people out of the narratives.
Right.
And so are you a researcher as well? Do you write?
I am, sort of. I do collaborative research predominantly. I'm not I don't envision myself on the sort of NIH K to R kind of pathway, mostly because if you're going to go on that pathway in medicine, you have to give up a lot of clinic, and I don't want to do that. As challenging as clinic can be sometimes, it's exciting and it's fun, and I like seeing patients. And if there were more hours in the day, maybe I would do more research. But if I had to pick, I'd rather see patients than do research. What I do kind of research-wise is a couple of things. I'm a movement disorder specialist, and so I mostly see people with Parkinson's disease and other related movement disorders. And so my research interest or my research focus is a little bit around that. One of the projects I've gotten involved in, which is really exciting to me because it's a marriage of movement disorders and narrative medicine, is something called the Parkinson's Disease Education Consortium, which is run by the Michael J. Fox Foundation. And it's essentially this enormous 40,000 people with Parkinson's disease who are enrolled in this online study. And most of it is surveys that they fill out sort of online or there's an app now that they can fill them out on their phone. But one of the things that they've done within that kind of large cohort is something called this PDEC, Parkinson's Disease Education Consortium, and have collected a lot of qualitative interviews, both telephone interviews with patients or their care partners, as well as some sort of open-ended survey data. There's a lot of patient journals that we're collecting through Fox Insight and through PDEC that I'm still unsure what the best use of that would be, and how we can use that in the most sort of giving way, because people have taken time to sort of journal and include like photos and letters to family members in these patient journals. So that I'm still trying to figure out what the best use of those journals would be, but the rest of it, the interviews and the survey responses, I'm in the process of analyzing with a qualitative research team to try to get at questions of, we have quality of life scales for Parkinson's as well as for other diseases, but it's not clear that they capture what really matters the most to folks. So what are the quality of life scales missing? How are people communicating with their doctors about issues, both sort of non-motor issues in Parkinson's disease, like fatigue, for instance, and how can we as physicians and providers be better about asking those questions to people and making sure that it's on our radar when we're talking to people about some of these challenges.
And I was going to ask you about the way that you sort of translate back and forth between movement and narrative. And is there any way in which you see the motor dimension as being narrative? And how do you work with that with your patients?
Yeah, I mean, I think in a couple of different ways. So there's the actual physicality of the body as telling a story. I was telling my fellow just the other day that like 90% of a movement disorders exam is observation, because you're watching how a person sits in the chair and moves, like how their embodiment is telling a story about what's going on with them, or what might be going on with them. And then there's also, I think increasingly in the last several years, we in the Parkinson's space have really realized that it's so much more than a physical movement disorder. And there's a lot going on the what's traditionally been called the non-motor symptoms of Parkinson's. Things like fatigue and sexual dysfunction and sleep and all of these things that impact so hugely on people's lives. And yet we as physicians are not great about asking about and documenting and remembering when we're meeting with patients. So I think it's sort of a dual thing. One is the embodied story, and the other is how the disease is impacting all of these other components of a person's life that, again, like traditionally were not considered part of movement disorders, but I really like they are, frankly. And I think we do folks a disservice if we don't think about it enough and ask about it enough and think about sort of the whole patient instead of this tiny little segment of the patient, if you will.
And so where do you see narrative medicine going in future years? And do you think that it's going to stay primarily within the medical sphere, or will it sprawl into other areas, as we're seeing to some extent here at Duke in undergraduate education, and perhaps also into community storytelling?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really where it's going to, or I hope it's going to go. So I think, traditionally, I think it's been used in two arenas, which are sort of medical education, like for medical students or trainees, and for patients to sort of tell their story and tell their narrative. But I think it can offer so much more, and I think and I hope that over time it'll start to bring in more of the health humanities more than medical humanities, because there's a lot more going on that I think could be part of narrative medicine. And I hope that it's already spreading, if you will, in some ways into the undergraduate curriculum, as you said. It was certainly that way when I was an undergraduate at UVA. As I said, like this one course was sort of the thing that sparked my knowledge about this whole field. But I think bringing it out into community practice is really where it will, I hope, thrive. Because I think academic medicine is such a small piece of medical practice. And I think I do feel that the place where narrative medicine may be needed the most is in the community, because that's where most patients are seen most of the time. And so making sure that community providers are aware of this, know how to use it effectively in a clinical setting. One of the things that I always get pushback whenever I say that is, oh, this is going to take so much time, and I'm always busy in clinic, and I'm rushed, and what I have realized over and over is that paying attention to the narrative of what's happening in the room makes me so much more efficient as a physician, because I think I'm much more aware of the story that the patient is trying to tell, and the story that the patient's family members are trying to sort of convey to me silently, often on the side. And so, and being able to hear that story and knowing how to hear that story, I think makes you so much more efficient as a physician. Because otherwise, and I'm not by any means saying that I'm like the perfect doctor, but to be able to listen to that story allows you to not run in circles where you're asking one question and the patient's trying to answer a different question, and you're just kind of going back and forth and not really going anywhere. And it feels like you're just in this time loop of never getting the answer, the knowledge that you want. But if you can figure out how to ask that in a different way, or listen to some other piece of that story, I mean, Osler said it, the patient is telling you what he has, so listen to the patient. And I think that message gets lost a lot of the time when folks are kind of focused on, like, check off a bunch of boxes in the electronic medical record and move on to the next room. Like, that's not a way to care for people.
I mean, that's a beautiful paradigm because, efficiency really does reign in medical paradigms, and we don't think of it as being aligned with storytelling and with really good listening and processing of narrative. So to have a kind of narrative-based efficiency that potentially can be more satisfying to both clinician and the person seeking their assistance is inspiring. I think in the undergraduate health humanities arena, I'm sure that on some level we are all motivated by the fact that so many of our undergrads are moving toward medical careers and the desire to be relevant. But it's also that when you really start to look through a health lens and an embodiment lens at literature, arts, you see health everywhere. Mm-hmm. And it's also the case that many of the writers that have always formed, or in modernity have formed a part of literary canons, had health problems of their own. And a colleague of mine at the University of Wisconsin-Madison thinks that may be because writing is a sedentary activity and actually gives rise to various potential health problems. But certainly when we look at figures that are sort of landmark names for many of us, like Marcel Proust, I think that that's a widely recognized literary name, and his paradigm of the Madeleine is also widely known. It's a moment where a character, on dipping a piece of this little shell shaped cake into tea, suddenly experiences this wild unfolding of memory in kind of extraordinary, discrete reconsolidation, and it's something that that brings him back into a relationship of access to his childhood that we normally never have. And Proust has long been seen as a kind of iconic rememberer, because In Search of Lost Time is so much about the rediscovery of memory. But it has also been noted that he is really showing involuntary memory consolidation and showing some of the more complex areas of memory research that were starting to happen in his era. And so there's a kind of dialogue between what he is writing about and what people are studying from other vantage points. And for me, as a literary scholar, I became really interested by his health problems and the fact that his father was a researcher of an illness called neurasthenia. Mm-hmm. And when you read Adrian Proust's work on neurasthenia, he almost appears to be describing his son. And there are actually a lot of compelling reasons to believe that he is describing Marcel. And one of the aspects of neurasthenia, which actually is no longer current as a diagnosis in the US, but is still in some places, like China, I gather, still has a neurasthenia diagnosis. But one of the things that Marcel Proust pointed out was that neurasthenics felt that they had little control of memory, that memory was always just slipping beyond their grasp, and that they had a kind of brain fog. And in that context, you can see Marcel Proust not as a sort of Homeric hero of memory, but as someone who, via dysfunction, is testing it and probing it and trying to reach it, and doing so in this kind of exquisite narrative process. you know.
Yeah, no, that's really, I didn't know that at all about Proust's father, or I guess Adrian Proust, but I almost wonder if, knowing that and knowing kind of the hallmarks of neurasthenia, if you will, if that episode with the Madeleine is almost like writing in resistance to this concept of sort of brain fog, right? Because I can imagine how, like, that is, it's such a tight, beautiful piece of writing, and it's so laden with sensory detail, and so I think it almost proves that, like if one of the things that marks neurasthenics is this sort of inability to hold on to memory or recall memory, and his son may or may not have been a neurasthenic, reading Marcel Proust's descriptions there then almost seem like he's completely rejecting that label or that diagnosis.
You could look at it
Yeah.
either way. You could see it as his attempt to sort of phenomenologically, regain access to memory by just really endlessly seeking every little trace of it. Or you could see it as sort of narrative within narrative, counter narrative to his father's narrative. But in terms of the In Search of Lost Time title, it's fascinating that his father actually said that neurasthenic patients were always in search of lost memory. And so, it's one word away from the title of Marcel's master opus. And there are many other examples. Gustave Flaubert, the novelist, is believed to have had epilepsy. And he's well known as, this extraordinary realist writer. And he would say things like that the narrator or the author should be like God in the universe, sort of, omnipresent, but never revealing, able to see everything, but never revealing himself. And so Flaubert, comes across that way, and we have long said that about his work. But when you really study his accounts of what happened around his seizure experiences, you start to see that everywhere in his fiction, his elderly female characters, characters who are very unlike him, have similar episodes. And you start to realize, again, that there's this tension between this, someone who is mostly an invalid, writing because he was at home living with his mother, and that was, because of illness, what his life was limited to. And yet, as he sort of sees this world that he wants to make sort of coefficient with the actual reality that he is somewhat outside of, there's a way in which the knowing and the kind of gaps in knowing that he experienced with epilepsy are structuring that reality.
Interesting. That's fascinating.
Yeah.
We should do something together with, like, between the neurology of these, I know you do the neurohumanities stuff with Flaubert, and I'd love to hear more about that, actually, because
No, we should sometime and look for materials about Parkinson's.
Yeah, well, I mean, the best description of Parkinson's disease I think I've ever read is in Little Dorrit. One of the little Amy Dorrit's uncle, and I'm always, the two brothers, William and Frederick Dorrit, and I can never remember which one of them is which because they're kind of twin.
You can be forgiven.
Yeah. But the uncle, Clennam goes to visit him to get some information that he wants about the Dorrit family. And this description of the uncle sort of shuffling in the living room and sort of reaching for something, and he's got a tremor while he's taking he's pouring out his stuff. It's such a exquisite description of Parkinson's. I remember reading that and just like sitting up and being like, oh my goodness. And, it was written about maybe 20 years or so after James Parkinson published his case series of PD. I highly
Which was
doubt
what-
that,
so
which was
what-
in 1817
Okay.
is when Parkinson wrote his case series. And then Little Dorrit was, I believe, in the late 1830s or early 1840s. And so, but I really doubt that, Dickens had gone into the, medical literature and dug up this case series. So it's interesting because honestly, just like James Parkinson, most of those patients in that case series were observational, people he saw on the street, and sort of described what he saw. And I think Dickens and a lot of the realist writers from the 19th century really do that so well, sort of describing what you see.
And who knows, maybe they were following some trends in medical discoveries, because certainly in the 19th century in France, there were debates among scientists at which writers like Honoré de Balzac and all kinds of artists and writers would attend, because they were really interested in Balzac. In the avant-propos to the human comedy, comes up with this idea of the social species, that precisely comes out of these debates between Cuvier and Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire, and then later in the century, the work of the neurologist Charcot. His seminars are his grand rounds and seminars are attended by everyone from Freud to Maupassant to I mean,
I know there's a lot of, I think, interweaving and interlinking,
and a fascination, a mutual fascination between the world of letters and that of medicine.
Yeah.
Now, I had asked if you might have any a passage that you would want to share with us to sort of, show us what you do with narrative.
Sure. So I actually, I don't know how many people here have read Her Body and Other Parties by Carmen Maria Machado. It's a fantastic book of short stories. But I was reading one of them, the first one in the collection, The Husband's Stitch. And there's this one passage, it's a little over a page, but if you wouldn't mind,
Please.
I'll do the whole thing. All right. Of all the stories I know about mothers, this one is the most real. A young American girl is visiting Paris with her mother when the woman begins to feel ill. They decide to check into a hotel for a few days so the mother can rest, and the daughter calls for a doctor to assess her. After a brief examination, the doctor tells the daughter that all her mother needs is some medicine. He takes the daughter to a taxi, gives the driver instructions in French, and explains to the girl that the driver will take her to his residence, where his wife will give her the appropriate remedy. They drive and drive for a very long time, and when the girl arrives, she is frustrated by the unbearable slowness of this doctor's wife, who meticulously assembles the pills from powder. When she gets back in the taxi, the driver meanders down the streets, sometimes doubling back on the same avenue. Frustrated, the girl gets out of the taxi to return to the hotel on foot. When she finally arrives, the hotel clerk tells her that he has never seen her before. When she runs up to the room where her mother had been resting, she finds the walls a different color, the furnishings different than her memory, and her mother is nowhere in sight. There are many endings to the story. In one of them, the girl is gloriously persistent and certain, renting a room nearby and staking out the hotel, eventually seducing a young man who works in the laundry and discovering the truth, that her mother had died of a highly contagious and fatal disease, departing this plane shortly after the daughter was sent from the hotel by the doctor. To avoid a citywide panic, the staff removed and buried her body, repainted and refurnished the room, and bribed all involved to deny that they had ever met the pair. In another version of this story, the girl wanders the streets of Paris for years, believing that she is mad, that she invented her mother and her life with her mother in her own diseased mind. The daughter stumbles from hotel to hotel, confused and grieving, though for whom she cannot say. Each time she is ejected from another posh lobby, she weeps for something lost. Her mother is dead, and she does not know it. She won't know it until she herself is also dead, assuming that you believe in paradise. I don't need to tell you the moral of this story. I think you already know what it is.
And how would you open
How would
that
I?
topic?
I mean, I think I think that story sort of brings up, several things. One is it's a story sort of, at least on the surface, about illness and death and so on. And I actually don't usually use illness stories when running narrative medicine workshops. I think in part because there's this tendency to focus on what is the illness and let's diagnose this patient and not think about some of the other things that are happening. So this does kind of have an illness, but it's not really about the illness, right? It's about ways of knowing, I suppose, and perspective, and whose truth is the real truth. The longer story, the husband stitch, where this that excerpt is taken from, is sort of about a lot of different urban legends and the ways that urban legends and sort of play on some of these fears that we have, that, what if the reality that we are living in, we suddenly discover is not really reality, yeah, so I think it opens up a lot of sort of big questions about whose authority are we going to believe here? Are we going to believe the narrator? Are we going to believe the girl? Are we going to believe the doctor? There's a lot of different sort of layers in reading that story, and you have to be able to hold all of that in your mind at once when thinking about it.
Which also reminds me of Susannah Cattl's Brain on Fire, where she is having seizures, but appears to be psychotic and is psychotic, and eventually has to decode, in part just from video monitoring of her room, what went on in the months that she lost before she was treated for her illness. Well, shall we open up to questions about narrative medicine and about what Sneha does in her practice and also in her narrative medicine workshops?
I have two thoughts and one question. So one of the thoughts I had to jot down, but going back to talking about burnout, it occurred to me, it wasn't lost on me that the term moral injury and moral distress is now used to describe PTSD for war veterans. And it made me really think about how the accepted therapy for PTSD tends to be exposure therapy, and how that could potentially worsen moral distress by reliving and not really processing. And I think I've read about rituals of forgiveness as a way to address moral injury and distress. But now I'm wondering if narrative therapy could be an option.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is used very much in that vein, especially recently. I think you're right that I think a lot of this moral injury work has been done in the PTSD kind of sphere. And I think I do, there's always in the back of my mind this caution that we don't want to sort of take the experience of veterans and just wholesale transfer it to the experience of doctors, because there's a lot of different things happening there, right? When we think about privilege and who gets care and what's happening to people. But I do think, I mean, historically, medicine has had a lot of military metaphors, both in the way we sort of fight disease, right? And when you're a resident, you're sort of in the trenches, on the front lines. We use these words as it is. And I think I don't know that, I feel like exposure therapy for burnout is kind of just more, exposing somebody to something, whether it's burnout or PTSD, without giving them the space to process it, I think it is going to run the risk of making things worse. And I think that's where narrative medicine and narrative therapy can really come in, is encouraging people to work through some of those processes and sort of, for instance, I am very much a traditional writer with a pen and paper because I do feel that getting it out on the page as a physical, tangible thing then makes it not in the back of my mind and sort of constantly thinking about it. And then carrying that into my next interaction with that patient or my next interaction with the next patient who has nothing to do with whatever I was just talking about with patient number one. So I actually keep a small like moleskin notebook in my white coat pocket. And whenever I have a difficult conversation or a difficult moment in clinic where I'm like, I don't think that went as well as I would have liked it to, I'll scribble something down, and I'll often go back to that later that evening and kind of expand it out and think about, how should I, like, what different perspectives, what different styles should I have used, and I think it does help with this sort of prevention of distress and burnout, because otherwise it's always lingering in the back of your mind. And if you can make it external and on paper and physical, I think it does help with that.
Definitely do that in the future.
Yes.
And your question is fascinating too, because the notion of moral injury, should we associate that with traumatic experiences like rape? I don't think we actually have really good ways of differentiating between moral injury and trauma. There may be the idea that safety, certain kinds of safety, sort of separate out the moral injury from the trauma, and then there are probably also moral injuries that have more to do with a sense of sort of reduced horizon of what you might do about something, and therefore of your personhood, as opposed to plunging you into the physiological, stress reactions of trauma, which I think have been shown in relation to narrative therapy to be effective in certain time windows and not effective in others, that there needs to be a gap of time after safety has been established and all of that. So it is fascinating the way that narrative does actually have sort of, sanctioned uses, sanctioned therapeutic uses, and not in post-traumatic stress contexts.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah.
Can I ask a second question after whoever?
Okay, but I'd love to pick up where you started, because I think there was a really powerful moment, your example of that light bulb over your head when you were struggling. What should I do in this moment? How could I intervene with this patient, not feeling that you had the legitimacy to deliver that prognosis? And thinking what's missing in my education is narrative medicine, not more and better medical education. And that was what pushed you to go into narrative medicine, to be a good doctor. Okay, so I just wanted to sort of throw out what is a good doctor and kind of explore that question.
Yes. That is a
Who's
good
defining it, and how for you in that moment, being a good doctor, your training wasn't leading you to being a good doctor,
That's
right?
very good. Yeah, no, it wasn't.
And turning to something that was not medical training to be a good doctor, that's kind of the thread that I wanted to explore a little bit more. There's a fantastic book by a woman named Kate Scannell called The Death of the Good Doctor. She's an HIV/AIDS doctor. It's out of print, but where for her the moment that she felt that she was trained to be a good doctor, efficient and effective and thorough and all of that, but she felt that died the moment that she failed her patients. So this is early in the HIV/AIDS epidemic, no treatment. She was on the ward in San Francisco. Families were deserting their patients and things like that. And she said, I'm not a good doctor here because I can't address what's going on with my patients with what I've been trained with. I need something else. And so she turned to narrative medicine. And she didn't say it that way, But storytelling and connecting with her patients through story was the way that she became a different kind of good doctor.
Yeah.
So I'd love to just hear your thoughts on feeling abandoned on your road to being a good doctor by your training to be a good doctor. That's sort of a paradox.
Yeah, no, it is a little bit of a paradox because I think the way, I guess it depends, it really does depend, I think, who you ask what makes a good doctor.
Right.
I think the person or the person or the group with the most stake and who we should be listening to most about who makes a good doctor is the patient. Because really, I mean, other people may have gone into medicine for other reasons, but the thing that drew me to it is because I wanted to do something practical, tangible, that would reduce human suffering. And I don't think you can do that without being able to hear the story of the suffering. Now, other people, you know, there are plenty of people who go into medicine for other reasons, and I think they would define being a good doctor in a very different way. You know, administrators would probably define it as who's the most efficient in clinic and seeing the most patients and has the, you know, least access time where somebody can get in tomorrow if they need to see somebody. I think researchers, like bench researchers, would define it as who's bringing in the most NIH grant money. But I mean, at the end of the day, like what we do as doctors is this really challenging and humbling and amazing, unique ability to just sit down with somebody and talk about what's going on in their lives. Like it's just, every day I'm getting emotional about it. Like it's just, it's the best thing I think I could ever do. And I don't think I could do it without narrative medicine. Or I don't think that I was being trained to do it well without narrative medicine. Now, different med schools, again, probably have different curricula and whatever. Columbia's curricula was very heavy on the basic sciences and mechanistic views of the body, which is, I mean, I get it. And you need to know that kind of stuff if you're going to be an effective doctor, right? Like you could sit down and hold somebody's hand for as long as you want, but if you don't understand the process that's happening to them in their body, then you're not filling the role that they need you for necessarily. And so I think knowing the science and knowing the mechanisms of how the drugs we prescribe, how they work, is essential, but it's necessary, but it's not sufficient, I guess is what I would say. Is that what's really the core of it is being able to hear stories and being able to convey stories, right? Like when I tell somebody they have Parkinson's disease, that term is coming with a whole lot of story behind it. There's the story that I know about Parkinson's, like the mechanism of Parkinson's disease. I know what causes it. I know where in the brain is being targeted. I know how the drugs I'm going to prescribe are going to affect it in that way. So there's that story. But there's also this story that's, when you tell somebody Parkinson's disease, like that's going to bring up a whole lot of stuff. And I think if you ignore that or try to ignore it, like you're just never going to be able to get anywhere. You need to be able to engage with what the patient's story of Parkinson's disease is, which is going to be different from patient to patient. But I think sort of treating people as, traditionally, scientifically, whatever things are flat in medicine. We prescribe the same drugs to the same people. Not the same people, the same drugs in the same way to different people. And I think we're only starting to get a handle on how the storytelling impacts the way people do and the way people live well with a, life-changing diagnosis.
So just a quick...
I don't know if that answered your question.
Well, I was going to quickly just extend your question to Frank, and around the Osler. What is the group called?
The Oslo Literary Roundtable.
Yeah, and so how you might answer that question and how narrative medicine has impacted your understanding of the good doctor.
Well, I don't know that I can answer that question, so probably will give you a different answer. Because I keep thinking about the fact that what do we think was happening before we had narrative medicine? And I don't know that it was so very different.
I would agree with that. I mean, I think what narrative medicine is what medicine has always been about. And I feel like, or at least when I was in early stages of med school, I felt like that had gotten lost in the, I don't know, the scientific push or what, but it just.
Or the efficiency.
The efficiency, yeah,
efficiency
exactly.
push.
But even, I mean, as a medical student, you're a little bit isolated or from the economic efficiency side of things, which is good. But I do think that there was just this, it was like this divide. Like you're talking in the 19th century, the world of literature and the world of science were so connected in a way that I think they started to pull apart. I mean, like C.P. Snow's big thing about the
two
divide
cultures.
between arts and sciences. And I think narrative medicine is trying to get back in that. And it's, I think there's always going to be time pressures and struggles and so on.
But it's a great intervention that
yeah.
it's not the innovation, it's the tradition.
Yeah.
Or it's the innovation that reaches back to a tradition. But then I know that, so Carrie had one other thing to say, and then I believe, I don't know your name, but you had one other question, and then we'll go to Elizabeth, right?
Well, just quickly, so I'm just thinking about perhaps the sphere where narrative medicine can be most potent is exactly where you practice, which is with an incurable disease. And I'm thinking about Kate Scannell's work, treating AIDS patients at the end of their lives, where medicine, there is no more you can do, or there's very little. And so maybe that kind of opens up this space for narrative medicine to have a role and to have a purpose.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. I mean, I think areas like neurology, psychiatry, palliative care, those are, I think, the fields that have been most open to narrative. There are certainly people in other fields who do this, but those are often people who sort of tend to gravitate towards this by the nature of our work.
I imagine that you might get this kind of question a lot, so forgive me if that's true. But I wanted to ask about the power dynamic in narrative medicine, especially as just today I was in class and we were talking about how we encode so much meaning into these like semiotic webs, or like these layers and layers of meaning into narrative, and then it can be a very subversive task in some cases, and then to decode that kind of message in someone's story or speech or whatever form of expression, that can also be equally subversive. And so I wonder if in your work as an academic or a writer or a reader or a clinician, you have any examples of narrative medicine serving as a subversive practice?
Yeah, so many. I think it is inherently subversive. I think because of this, I hate to be like that person who blames everything on the electronic medical record, but increasingly it feels like Mad Libs, clicking through the check boxes of the EMR. And so I think just the fact that you write a narrative about what's happening with the patient is inherently subversive. Like I'm doing something that is not, it's not unapproved by sort of, but increase with all of this sort of efficiency drive. People tell you, make your note more check boxes and more sort of click buttons and menus and all this stuff, which I mean I could do, I don't want to do, because I want to keep, I think writing fiction, writing a narrative note, first of all, is unusual as a physician. I get lots of notes and referrals from people who are sort of check-boxy type notes that convey no meaning. And so I think just writing something that is not a bunch of click boxes is inherently subversive. I think writing fiction in particular, which I do in my extremely limited free time, is also, it's subversive in a different way, because it's sort of an attempt or a moment of reimagining what may have happened or what could have happened. I do think there's always a danger when you're writing about patients that you don't want to speak for a patient, right? Because there is going to be this power dynamic between physician and patient. So I think that can lead people into trouble if they're not careful and kind about how they do it. But I think it does provide a different lens in which to view this sort of continual progress narrative that we tell ourselves about medical care and medical treatment. So I don't know if that
And maybe
answers your
that's,
question.
you know, again, an opening onto a kind of narrative partners sort of understanding
exactly.
of the community relation to medicine, that narratives are created and have a need to be created from multiple perspectives.
I was just, I mean, in hearing you talk about it, I just keep wondering about this tension between, because we're talking about like the 19th century, 18th century, when people choose to go into medicine now, I think you have an image, but there's this tension about all these things we've accomplished and learned and have to treat, and that are going to, quote unquote, fix things or make them better, and people almost expect that there's a medicine or a something that you can give me that's going to fix this. And the envisioning of being a helping person. And I think there's a lot of tension in that, in the training that you go through. And so you're talking, it really resonated when you're talking about getting lost in what I thought I was going to be doing and the stories I was going to be hearing and the people I was going to feel that sense of connection with that I'm not. And and in some ways I think medicine has been its own worst enemy by publicizing all these things that we have to offer, as opposed to what used to be being present with someone. And how do you take in that narrative for that individual that you can't say is everybody else's story with Parkinson's. It's their story. And to be so present for that you can give individualized care for that person. And yes, the expertise is assumed.
Yeah.
It's the other pieces that I feel like we're kind of losing.
I would agree. I mean, I agree. I mean, I think it's a real challenge, I think, in sort of thinking about medical education and the next generation of physicians, like, because I think there's ever growing medical knowledge that needs to be learned, but I think it almost feels like the more you add to the scientific side of the curriculum, are you losing something from the humanistic side of the curriculum and the personal side of the curriculum. I think there is, in the last few years, been a little bit more of a pushback on that. So I'm hopeful that the pendulum will sort of swing back. Because, I mean, just last night I was reading admissions essays for Duke's Medical School, and so many of the essays are about these sort of relationships that people develop while they're scribing or while they're shadowing a doctor or something, and that's what's drawing people in, and we need to not let them lose that, because I think there is a real danger of sort of getting lost in the weeds of how this particular cardiac enzyme works or this drug or whatnot, that you get too focused on that and you lose the big picture. Like that's what was happening to me, frankly, when I was a student, narrative medicine is how I managed to sort of at least attempt to recapture that.
Mm-hmm.
One last question, and then
So this, excuse me if this is a naive question, but I really appreciate you sharing all the insight you have. So going back actually to what you started out with telling us about this tension you were trying to resolve, and not only being present for the stories, but then also being able to use narratives to explain things to the patient, like the position they're in and how to, I think you phrased it like how to fit it into their story, which I really liked. But I'm also, so I'm inspired by that. At the same time, I have a similar worry about the subversiveness that could, in the power dynamics that could be involved with you helping someone understand their story, but then that also creates kind of narrative for them in the same way.
Yeah.
So you want to be present for it, but then you're also trying to help them create the narrative. And if there's a power dynamic, then that creates kind of a risk of pushing the story in a certain direction. If that makes sense. And I think like what it comes to mind as an example is like end of life care has changed drastically. I think in terms of us becoming more accepting to people's stories in terms of this is my quality of life, this is how the end of my story, I want the end of my story to be, you know? And so I'm just wondering, first of all, I guess the first part of my question was, how do these narratives actually work, not just in terms of clicking boxes, but, you know, if you were, again, this is me being naive, but like if you were like, hey, have you seen this movie? Like, do you remember how this happened to the character? Like, is that one way you could actually help create a narrative? Is like in terms of descriptively? And then I guess my other part of the question is normative and how kind of actually navigating that with the power dynamics involved.
Yeah, no, I mean, both of those are really good questions, are really good points. For the first one, like the sort of giving examples or giving pre-existing narratives as examples, I would say, I mean, I don't do that a ton. The one place that I'll use that is, so in the Parkinson's world, we have this word dyskinesia, which means sort of these extra wiggly, restless type movements. And there's no good sort of translation for that back into like normal English other than this sort of vague wiggliness that is hard to kind of grasp. So I'll say, so Michael J. Fox is quite dyskinetic on purpose. He sort of keeps his medication level high. And that makes him visibly dyskinetic. And so I'll say, like, if you've seen Michael J. Fox speak on TV, like he's always kind of moving around in his chair and looks very restless. To sort of help people understand what I mean when I use this really jargony word that I don't have another good word for. I know other people who use sort of media references a lot. I tend not to, just because I don't want to, number one, a lot of what you see in the media isn't reality. And number two, I don't want to like assume that somebody's seen, XYZ show or whatever. The moment when that happened is when, so there's this very rare disease called progressive supranuclear palsy. It's a mimic of Parkinson's disease. Dudley Moore had it and died with it. And I remember like making a reference to that once, not with a patient, but with a student, and they just gave me this blank look, and I was like, I've gotten too old. I need to like come up with new references. Yeah, exactly. And so, so I don't do that anymore. But for the other piece of it, I mean, I think, so for instance, like if I say Parkinson's, I keep going back to Parkinson's just because it's such a common. If I say Parkinson's disease, that is going to bring up a lot of thoughts for people in different ways, depending on what they've seen or read or heard. A lot of people, by the time they come to see me, have like, if they have internet access, have looked stuff up online about what they think might be going on and whatever. So it's often in the back of people's minds. And I'll start off by saying like, what do you, like, what is your understanding of that? To try to get a sense of what narrative they're bringing into the room. Because if I just launch into my sort of spiel about dopamine and neurotransmitters and all that, like that doesn't answer any of the questions that anybody has at that moment. And the question that they often have that people will sometimes say outright and sometimes won't, is what is my life going to look like in 5 years, right? So if I get a sense of kind of what have they thought about, like, is what's happening in the back of their mind? And I tend to just kind of ask, rather than kind of try to dance around it, because I found that dancing around issues, you dance a lot, and you never get anywhere. But yeah, I mean, and sometimes it's more challenging. Sometimes it's a very, very rare disease that we don't have great sort of statistics on what things are going to look like in 5 years. And it's a challenge, I think. But yeah, I think being really mindful of where people are coming from and what, not only sort of the narrative that they might have in the back of their mind about Parkinson's, but also what is this person's narrative within their family, and what is their narrative within their community, and who do they see themselves as, makes a huge difference in terms of, you know, even just on the very basic level, like what I might recommend as treatment. So.
All right, well, thank you so much for joining us for this conversation.